Imagine waking up tomorrow, pulling into the office, coffee in hand. You're feeling pretty good.
Right, because your team just finalized this massive, like, $5 million enterprise rollout for a suite of autonomous AI agents.
Exactly. The software works flawlessly. But then, by noon, you find out the National Security Agency just classified the foundational model powering your entire system as a national security risk.
Wow. Under a brand new, totally classified benchmark.
Yeah, and now you have 30 days to just rip it out of your infrastructure entirely.
Yeah.
Or, you face a $3 million penalty from the state of Illinois, plus a separate investigation by the European Union threatening, like, 7% of your global revenue.
Welcome to the 2026 AI procurement nightmare.
Seriously.
Because that $5 million software might be functioning perfectly from an engineering standpoint, but the legal foundation underneath it has essentially just vaporized overnight.
Right.
We're looking at a market where technical compatibility means absolutely nothing if you haven't solved for the geopolitical compliance.
And if you are listening to this deep dive today, it's because you are sitting in the blast radius of that exact scenario. You're a CISO or a procurement director, maybe a compliance officer, and you're trying to cut through the noise of, honestly, the most chaotic regulatory landscape in modern tech history.
Oh, without doubt.
So our mission today is mapping out this massive 2026 collision course of AI model safety rules. And to do that, we are tearing into a stack of sources that, frankly, reads like a geopolitical thriller.
Yeah, it really does.
We've got lead alerts from Ropes and Gray and Arnold and Porter. We've got these exhaustive compliance breakdowns from Layer 3 Labs area and ComplianceHub.wiki. Plus, alongside all that, some incredibly sharp security and privacy analyses from Meritalk and MyPrivacy.blog.
And the underlying tension running through every single one of those sources is basically a fundamental identity crisis.
How do you mean?
Well, the regulatory world is currently fighting a localized, real-time war over what artificial intelligence actually is.
Right, like how to classify it.
Exactly. Half the world wants to govern AI like a consumer product. Think automobiles or pharmaceuticals, right?
Yeah.
Requiring transparent safety labels, public crash testing metrics, standardized manufacturing protocols. But the other half, specifically the current U.S. administration, is pivoting hard toward treating frontier AI like a weapons system.
A weapons system. So that means classified benchmarks, intelligence agency oversight, voluntary defense partnerships, that whole realm.
Precisely.
And navigating that exact schizophrenic environment is why we need to pause and thank ComplianceHub.wiki and MyPrivacy.blog for sponsoring this deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely essential tools right now.
Because as we're about to explore in excruciating detail, balancing aggressive innovation timelines with rigorous privacy and compliance standards is the defining enterprise challenge of this decade.
Yeah.
You just cannot survive a compliance audit based on vibes.
No, definitely not.
You need concrete vendor questionnaires. You need certifiable data protection impact assessments, standardized templates. That is exactly what their platforms provide. They give you the operational map for this minefield we're about to walk into.
And you certainly need a map because the federal government just completely redrew the borders.
Yeah, they really did.
To understand this global fracture, we really have to start with the tectonic shift that hit Washington on June 2, 2026.
Right.
President Trump signed an executive order titled Promoting Advanced Artificial Intelligence Innovation and Security. And this document fundamentally rewrites the social contract between AI developers and the federal government.
Let's unpack the text of that order.
Yeah.
Because it is aggressively deregulatory.
Very much so.
It explicitly revokes the previous Biden-era frameworks, just sweeps away the mandatory reporting requirements, and that heavy reliance on the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to act as the primary safety referee.
Right. The new philosophy is heavily branded as an America-first approach to AI. The order actually goes out of its way to disclaim any mandatory licensing or pre-clearance requirements.
They argue that heavy-handed civilian regulation is basically a gift to foreign adversaries, right?
Exactly. But here's the fascinating sleight of hand that the legal alerts from Ropes and Gray point out. They aren't ignoring these massive frontier models. They're just handing the binoculars to someone else.
Okay, let's unpack this. Who do they hand the binoculars to?
They handed them directly to Fort Meade, the NSA.
Wow.
The most revolutionary mechanic in this June 2nd order is the implementation of a classified benchmarking process overseen entirely by the National Security Agency.
Which is wild because historically, technology regulation in the U.S. relies on public metrics.
Right, like when the EPA regulates emissions, the testing methodologies are published in the Federal Register. Everyone knows the math.
Yeah, the rules are public.
But this executive order mandates that the NSA will develop classified rubrics based on, and I quote, advanced cyber capabilities.
Okay, so let's look at the mechanics of that. If you are a developer and you're training a massive new large language model, you don't actually know the specific threshold that will classify your product as a threat.
No, you don't.
The EU uses public computing power metrics, raw FLOPs, floating point operations, to draw a clear line in the sand. But the NSA is looking at behavior, and they aren't telling you what behaviors trigger the alarm until you cross the tripwire.
And that shift from civilian transparency to intelligence classification creates immense friction for the market. I mean, the director of the NSA now possesses the unilateral authority to designate a commercial piece of software as a covered frontier model.
Right, and because the benchmarks are locked inside a sensitive compartmented information facility, SCIF, the developers are just operating in the dark.
Exactly. They have to assume that if their model demonstrates, say, a certain proficiency in writing zero-day malware or autonomously exploiting network vulnerabilities, it's going to get flagged. But the exact parameters, total state secret.
Which sets up the central mechanism of the order, the 30-day pre-release window. Right?
So once a model reaches that bleeding edge, the developers can voluntarily offer the federal government up to 30 days of exclusive access to poke, prod, and test the system before it goes public.
And the behind-the-scenes lobbying over that specific timeline is just incredible. Our sources point out that the original draft actually demanded a 90-day review period.
Wait, 90 days in AI development?
Yeah, a 90-day freeze in the current AI cycle is functionally a death sentence for a product's competitive advantage.
Seriously. I mean, we're seeing major iterations of frontier models dropping every few weeks.
Exactly. And that is why industry advocates, specifically venture capitalists like David Sachs, directly lobbied the administration to slash it.
They made the geopolitical argument, right, that forcing American tech companies to sit in a regulatory holding pattern for 3 months while the government runs red team exercises would just allow China to completely dominate the market cadence.
Exactly. So they compromised the 30 days. And again, crucially, it remains purely voluntary. Okay, but while the review of the model itself is voluntary, the deployment of the model carries some severe non-negotiable legal risks.
Yes, this is a massive point.
Because Section 4 of the order introduces a massive shift in criminal enforcement. It directs the Department of Justice to prioritize prosecuting AI-enabled cybercrime by dusting off the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the CFAA.
Right. And what really stands out in the Arnold and Porter analysis is the deliberate, explicit targeting of autonomous AI agents.
I want to ground this in a real-world scenario because the implications for enterprise deployers are frankly terrifying. Let's say a marketing firm buys a highly sophisticated autonomous AI agent designed to do competitive market research.
Okay, standard use case.
Right. The human operator gives it a prompt. Gather all available pricing data on our top 3 competitors. And then the human goes to lunch.
As you do.
The AI agent starts scraping public websites. But then it hits a login screen. It hallucinates a creative solution, utilizes a known vulnerability in the competitor's API, bypasses the authentication, and downloads an entire proprietary database.
Ouch.
Yeah. Under Section 4, the DOJ is signaling they won't just treat that as a civil dispute between the two companies. They will look at prosecuting the deploying company under the CFAA for exceeding authorized access.
Because the legal liability shifts dramatically from the developer who wrote the code to the enterprise that let the agent off the leash.
Wow. So you're responsible for what your AI does while you're at lunch.
Exactly. The government is establishing a framework where you are strictly liable for the digital trespassing of your autonomous systems. You cannot argue that the AI acted unpredictably. The very act of deploying an unbounded agent constitutes negligence.
That creates a fascinating paradox in the federal strategy, doesn't it? They're completely removing mandatory safety checks on the assembly line, but threatening catastrophic criminal penalties if the car crashes after you buy it.
That's a great way to put it. The administration is betting the farm on these market incentives and post-incident penalties being enough to maintain order.
Which raises the obvious question, when you hand the tech industry a rulebook they can literally opt out of, who actually plays along?
Right. And the reaction across the sector is deeply fractured. It cleanly divides the cybersecurity leadership from the privacy advocates.
Let's start with the network defenders. From their perspective, this executive order is a masterclass in pragmatic security.
Oh, they love it. The reporting from Merit Talk highlights profound support from the trenches. Chief information security officers at infrastructure giants like Cisco, Zscaler, Fortinet, they are actively championing this approach.
But why do they prefer a voluntary system? You'd think security professionals would want mandatory, rigorous testing for every piece of software hitting the market.
You would think so, but they prefer it because mandatory regulation inherently breeds compliance-driven security, which is slow, bureaucratic, and let's be honest, largely performative.
Ah, check the box security.
Exactly. In a kinetic cyber environment, speed is the ultimate currency. If an AI model is discovered to have a critical vulnerability that allows for massive data exfiltration, the developers need to patch it in hours, not weeks.
And a mandatory framework slows that down.
Right. A mandatory regulatory framework often requires companies to submit patches for recertification, which stalls the deployment of the fix. By keeping the framework voluntary and collaborative, developers and the government can rapidly share threat intelligence and push updates without asking a regulator for permission. They view that 30-day window not as a regulatory hurdle, but as a strategic war room.
But the privacy advocates look at that exact same war room and see a cartel.
They absolutely do.
The analysis from myprivacy.blog, whose tools, again, are essential for untangling this mess, argues that voluntary frameworks are historically the tech industry's favorite weapon for killing actual legislation.
It functions as a pressure release valve.
Right. A few massive companies agree to a voluntary code of conduct. They issue a few press releases about their deep commitment to safety. The political pressure subsides, and then binding laws just quietly die in committee.
And the fatal flaw of a voluntary regime is adverse selection.
What does that mean in this context?
It means it inherently fails to capture the highest risk actors in the market. Consider the economics of compliance, right? The massive frontier labs, the deeply capitalized, highly scrutinized entities, they will absolutely opt into the NSA's 30-day review.
Because they have entire departments dedicated to government relations.
Exactly. They view this as the cost of doing business and a way to secure federal contracts. But the existential threat to public safety doesn't come from those well-lit, heavily funded labs. It comes from the scrappy, hyper-aggressive startups operating with tight runways, or offshore developers with zero institutional ethics.
And they're just going to ignore the voluntary review.
Of course they are. Those entities will bypass the review entirely, race to market, and proliferate high-risk models directly to consumers.
It essentially creates a fast lane for the most reckless drivers.
Exactly.
But the criticism from privacy advocates goes much deeper than just who participates. It's really about what the executive order fundamentally ignores.
Yes, the data.
Right. The document is absolutely obsessed with cybersecurity. It contains page after page detailing how to prevent these models from being hacked or how to stop them from writing malicious code. But it is completely, deafeningly silent on the origin of the data used to build them.
And that omission is the defining controversy of the June 2nd order. It treats AI as a piece of software to be secured, rather than an aggregation of data to be governed.
Think about the architecture of a generative AI model. Its entire capability is derived from the unconsented mass scraping of the public internet.
We are talking about the ingestion of trillions of data points. Copyrighted literature, proprietary code repositories, private conversations, vast amounts of personal biometric data.
It's the equivalent of a major financial institution building a state-of-the-art billion-dollar bank vault. They hire armed guards, install biometric locks, pour 3 feet of reinforced concrete to ensure nobody can steal the assets inside. But they completely ignore the fact that the assets inside the vault were actively looted from the surrounding town.
That is a perfect analogy. Securing the perimeter doesn't legitimize the contents. And human rights organizations are attacking that exact hypocrisy.
Yeah, Amnesty International recently issued a report labeling generative AI as unlawful by design.
That's a strong phrase.
Very. Their legal argument basically posits that the foundational act of creating these models violates fundamental privacy rights at an unprecedented industrialized scale. But the executive order's narrow focus on advanced cyber capabilities defines the data rights dimension entirely out of existence,
It just treats massive copyright infringement and privacy violations not as structural flaws to be regulated, but as, like, irrelevant externalities.
which forces the burden of privacy entirely onto the shoulders of enterprise deployers. If the federal government refuses to acknowledge the data provenance problem, the enterprises buying these tools inherit the legal liability when the original copyright holders or privacy regulators come knocking.
Yes, they do.
And this is why you cannot rely on federal assurances, and why implementing robust internal privacy audits using platforms like myprivacy.blog is not optional. You have to build your own shield.
Because the federal government is heavily focused on building its own shield.
Right.
While the rules governing the creation of AI models are voluntary, the federal mandates for securing critical infrastructure against those models are incredibly aggressive. Section 2 of the order directs CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to issue binding operational directives within 30 days.
And this isn't just about securing military servers at the Pentagon. The definition of critical infrastructure is sweeping.
Oh, it covers everything.
It brings in regional healthcare networks, municipal water facilities, local power grids, community banking networks. If you operate an IT department in any of those sectors, this federal directive is pointing a laser directly at your server racks.
And the directives push a very specific, modernized defensive posture because traditional cybersecurity paradigms are just failing against AI-enabled attacks. Critical infrastructure teams must move beyond theoretical risk and execute practical, immediate hardening.
What are the practical steps they need to take?
First, they have to drastically reduce their external attack surfaces. You cannot have legacy systems exposed to the public internet because AI vulnerability scanners will find and exploit them in minutes, not days.
Wow.
Minutes. Second, they must automate the patching cycle. Manual patch management is completely obsolete when you're facing automated AI-driven exploit generation.
The order also mandates a hard shift to zero-trust architectures, right?
Yeah.
Specifically emphasizing phishing-resistant authentication.
Yes, because AI makes deepfakes and highly personalized spear phishing trivial to generate at scale. Relying on SMS two-factor authentication or basic passwords is a critical vulnerability now. You have to verify every single request, every single time, assuming the network is already compromised.
Furthermore, the defense mechanisms themselves must evolve. Teams have to transition from signature-based threat detection, which just looks for known hashes of old malware, to behavior-based threat detection.
Because AI-generated malware is polymorphic, it rewrites its own code to avoid signature detection.
Right.
Behavioral systems ignore the code's signature and instead monitor what the code is attempting to do. If a seemingly benign script suddenly attempts to encrypt a vital database or exfiltrate massive amounts of data at 3:0 a.m., the behavioral system kills the process.
And all of this has to be anchored by immutable, segmented backups. If an AI-enabled ransomware attack successfully breaches the perimeter, they will immediately target the recovery data. If those backups aren't physically or cryptographically air-gapped, the organization cannot recover.
Okay, so CISA handles the infrastructure hardening, but the order also establishes a brand new AI cybersecurity clearinghouse led by the Treasury Department.
Yes, let's talk about that. The goal is to create a centralized hub where the tech industry and the federal government can pool threat intelligence and share vulnerabilities.
Which, on paper, sounds great.
Right. But if I'm a corporate CISO, I'm looking at that clearinghouse as a massive legal trap.
Oh, 100%.
If my team discovers a deep vulnerability in our proprietary AI stack, and we share that detailed diagnostic data with the Treasury Department just to be a good corporate citizen, what stops a plaintiff's attorney from subpoenaing that exact data during a class action lawsuit 6 months later to prove we were negligent?
That is the massive deterrent, the legal risk of vulnerability sharing. While there are certain statutory protections under the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, sharing highly sensitive diagnostic data with a federal hub creates a paper trail of known vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
If a breach occurs, plaintiff's counsel will absolutely attempt to pierce those protections through discovery to demonstrate that the company knew about the flaw but failed to patch it fast enough.
So CISOs are forced to perform this brutal calculus. Does the operational benefit of receiving early threat intelligence from the government outweigh the legal risk of voluntarily documenting your own security failures?
Exactly. And the federal government knows that hesitation exists. They know that without a mandate, companies will naturally hoard their vulnerability data to avoid liability. So to make this voluntary system actually function, They built in an overwhelming incentive structure.
The trusted partners tier.
Yes. This is the economic engine driving the entire executive order. The 30-day pre-release window isn't just about the NSA looking for malware. It is a joint selection process. Developers who opt in and pass the scrutiny are designated as trusted partners.
And what does that get them?
These partners are granted exclusive early access to frontier models before they are released to the broader commercial market.
The sheer market power of that designation is staggering. If you are an enterprise software company and you get trusted partner status, you get to build your new applications, test your integrations, and prepare your go-to-market strategy on the absolute cutting edge of AI models 30 days before your competitors even get the API keys.
It is a federally subsidized competitive advantage.
That's huge.
And it goes beyond early access. That designation effectively pre-clears these companies for highly lucrative government procurement contracts. The administration is using immense market pull to manufacture compliance.
They don't need a statutory stick when the carrot is a monopoly on early intelligence and billions of dollars in federal IT spending.
Exactly. If a company wants the newest technology and the biggest contracts, they will voluntarily submit to the intelligence review.
But the strategy of relying on market pull leaves an enormous structural void. By explicitly stating they will not mandate safety rules for the broader commercial market, the federal government basically abandoned the field.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Yes, it does. And that regulatory vacuum did not last long. Into this void step the European Union and individual U.S. states, and they are replacing the federal carrot with massive mandatory legal hammers.
The divergence between the U.S. federal approach and the rest of the regulatory world is really the defining crisis of 2026.
Let's talk about the European Union AI Act.
It is not relying on voluntary partnerships or classified intelligence metrics. It is a regime of absolute sheer force. And enforcement for general-purpose AI, the massive foundation models, begins on August 2, 2026.
Let's break down how the EU measures risk, because it is the exact opposite of the NSA's classified behavior tests. The EU uses public math.
Right.
Specifically, they established a public compute threshold of 10 to the 25th power FLOPs.
Yep. 125 FLOPs.
If a model requires more computing power than that to train, it is legally defined as a systemic risk. We need to explain why that specific number matters. It isn't arbitrary.
No, 10 to the 25th FLOPs is an astronomical amount of raw computing power. It essentially draws a hard line between older, less capable models like GPT-3 and the new era of massive frontier models like GPT-4 and beyond.
By anchoring the regulation to a physical metric, the raw processing power utilized during the training phase, the EU removes all ambiguity. You cannot argue with the math.
Right. If you cross that compute threshold, your model is presumed to possess capabilities that threaten systemic stability. You are immediately subjected to exhausting mandatory obligations.
Like what?
You must conduct extensive adversarial testing, you must implement stringent cybersecurity protocols, and you must publish detailed systemic risk mitigation strategies to public regulators.
And if you decide to ignore those mandates?
The penalties are designed to be existential. The EU can levy fines up to 15 million euros, or up to 7% of a company's global annual turnover, whichever is higher.
Wow, 7%.
For the tech giants dominating this space, 7% of global revenue translates to tens of billions of dollars. It instantly destroys profit margins and wipes out shareholder value.
The EU's strategy is to make the cost of non-compliance far exceed the cost of rigorous safety engineering. And this aggressive, mandatory approach isn't isolated to Europe. We are witnessing a massive coordinated rebellion at the state level within the U.S. Because the federal government retreated from consumer protection mandates, individual state legislatures are aggressively filling the void.
The Layer 3 Labs breakdown maps out a literal minefield of state laws. California passed SB 53, which heavily mirrors the EU approach. It sets a compute threshold of 10 to the 26th power FLOPs for frontier models.
So a slightly higher bar than Europe, but operating on the identical principle of transparent mathematical thresholds.
Right. If you cross it, you are heavily regulated. But then you look at the Midwest and things get incredibly punitive.
Illinois.
Yes, Illinois SB 315 is perhaps the most aggressive domestic regulatory framework ever constructed for technology.
Illinois does have a history of brutal tech enforcement. I mean, they pioneered the Biometric Information Privacy Act, which cost companies billions in class action settlements.
Exactly. And SB 315, which goes into effect January 1st, 2027, mandates rigorous annual third-party safety audits for any organization utilizing high-impact AI models. They don't care if you pass an NSA review. They demand independent verification of your safety protocols
And they enforce it with a staggering $3 million penalty per violation.
per violation. And you also have New York's RAISE Act enforcing aggressive algorithmic transparency, and Colorado's SB 24205 specifically targeting AI-driven discrimination in housing, employment, and lending.
So what does this all mean? The geopolitical reality for a multinational enterprise right now is absolute chaos. On a Tuesday, the U.S. federal government tells you to voluntarily submit your model for a classified NSA review to become a trusted partner. On Wednesday, the state of Illinois threatens to fine you $3 million if you don't publicly release a third-party safety audit. And on Thursday, the EU threatens 7% of your global revenue if you cross a specific FLOP threshold. How are these contradictory frameworks supposed to coexist?
They don't. They cannot coexist. They are fundamentally incompatible, and they are currently on a direct legal collision course.
Collision course.
Yes. The federal administration views these aggressive state laws as onerous, unconstitutional impediments to interstate commerce and national innovation. They're not simply ignoring the states, they are actively preparing for war.
Really?
Yeah, a previous executive order issued in December 2025 quietly established a specialized Department of Justice AI litigation task force.
Wait, so the federal government built a dedicated strike team of lawyers with the sole mandate of suing states over their AI safety laws.
Precisely. The strategy relies on the doctrine of federal preemption. The DOJ will argue in federal court that national security and interstate commerce supersedes state authority, seeking to systematically strike down laws like Illinois SB 315 and California SB 53.
So they want to forcefully clear the board to ensure the voluntary, deregulated federal market remains the only game in town.
That's the plan.
But if I'm a corporate compliance officer, what am I supposed to do with that information? Do I just pause all my compliance budgets, grab a coffee, and wait 3 years for the Supreme Court to decide if Illinois is allowed to fine me?
That is the most dangerous assumption an enterprise could make. You absolutely cannot wait for the DOJ litigation to play out.
Because federal constitutional challenges take years to resolve.
Exactly. Meanwhile, these state laws and the EU AI Act are going into effect immediately. A state judge in Illinois will not accept pending federal litigation as an excuse for ignoring a subpoena for your safety audits.
Right.
Furthermore, opting into the NSA's 30-day review provides zero legal shield against state or European regulators. Your federal alignment does not satisfy their binding legal mandates. Enterprises must build robust, comprehensive compliance programs targeting the strictest state and EU laws right now, or they will face catastrophic financial penalties long before the DOJ task force ever sees a courtroom.
Which transitions us from the theoretical legal chaos into the absolute operational reality.
That's the fun part.
Yeah. With intelligence agencies running classified benchmarks, states weaponizing $3 million fines, and the EU dropping billion-dollar revenue penalties. How does an enterprise procurement team actually buy and deploy AI safely without stepping on a legal landmine? You can't just send a standard software contract to a vendor and hope for the best.
No, hope is not a compliance strategy. This is where standardized enterprise procurement firm frameworks become the absolute lifeblood of corporate survival. You have to translate this chaotic, overlapping legal landscape into a rigid, structured checklist that your purchasing department, your legal team, and your IT engineers can operationalize.
And building that operational checklist from scratch is nearly impossible, which is why we need to give another massive shout out to ComplianceHub.wiki.
They really are making this manageable.
They are sponsoring this deep dive because their platform is built precisely for this moment. They provide the exact vendor questionnaires, the digital templates, and the compliance workbooks that procurement teams need to systematically evaluate AI vendors. If you are sitting there wondering how to draft an algorithmic discrimination testing requirement for a new vendor, stop wasting your legal budget and go download the frameworks from ComplianceHub.wiki.
Because the value of those templates is that they bridge the massive gap between abstract legal theory and daily corporate practice. When a procurement team is evaluating an AI vendor, they need a prioritization roadmap. They cannot test for everything, so they must start with the foundational baselines.
Okay, provide a simple breakdown for us. How should companies prioritize these frameworks?
For a U.S.-based organization, the absolute ground floor of any procurement strategy must be the NIST AI RMF, the National Institute of Standards and Technology's AI Risk Management Framework.
Now wait, Earlier, we mentioned that the new executive order moved away from NIST. So why is NIST still the baseline for enterprise procurement?
Because despite the federal shift toward the NSA for national security, NIST remains the universally recognized, consensus-driven standard for commercial risk management. It is free, it is deeply comprehensive, and most importantly, it offers explicit legal safe harbor under emerging state laws.
Safe harbor.
Yeah, Colorado's SB 24205, for example, dictates that if a company is sued for algorithmic discrimination, demonstrating strict, documented adherence to the NIST AI RMF provides a massive affirmative defense in court.
That's a huge protection. And the architecture of the NIST framework is brilliant because it forces an organization to think chronologically. It maps risk into 4 continuous functions: govern, map, measure, and manage.
Let's break those down.
Sure, govern forces leadership to actually establish policies and assign accountability. MAP requires the IT team to physically locate every instance where AI is touching corporate data. Measure demands empirical testing of those models for bias and security flaws. And manage requires ongoing, active mitigation of those risks over the life cycle of the product.
It's a phenomenal system. But the glaring issue with NIST is that nobody hands you a certificate when you finish. You can't staple a NIST certification to a vendor contract to prove you are safe.
Which is why NIST is necessary, but insufficient for global enterprises.
Right. If your company operates internationally or sells software to major European or Asian enterprise buyers, you must elevate your procurement standards to prioritize ISO/IS 42001.
We need to unpack ISO 42001 in detail because it's fundamentally restructuring international procurement.
ISO 42001 is the first certifiable international standard for AI management systems. The key word is certifiable. Unlike NIST, which is a self-guided framework, ISO requires an accredited, independent, third-party auditor to thoroughly examine your technical architecture, your governance policies, and your risk mitigation strategies.
So when a massive European financial institution is evaluating your AI software, they don't want to hear about your internal commitment to safety. They demand to see the ISO 42001 certificate signed by an auditor they trust.
Exactly. Furthermore, ISO 42001 is designed to integrate seamlessly into a company's existing compliance ecosystem. If you already maintain ISO 27001 for information security, or if you have a mature GDPR privacy architecture, ISO 42001 layers directly on top of those existing processes without requiring you to build a new department from scratch.
So U.S. enterprises use NIST to build their internal defense and graduate to ISO 42001 to prove that defense to the global market.
Yep.
But what about the companies actually building the massive foundation models? The OpenAIs, the Anthropics, the Googles of the world. They aren't just relying on standard enterprise frameworks. They have essentially written their own constitutions.
They had to. The frontier labs realized that traditional regulatory frameworks were moving too slowly to capture the bleeding edge of capability. Consequently, they published their own highly sophisticated voluntary internal policies. You have Anthropic's responsible scaling policy, OpenAI's preparedness framework, and Google's frontier safety framework.
What's in those frameworks?
These documents meticulously outline exactly how they test models for catastrophic risks, like the ability to aid in the creation of biological weapons or conduct automated cyber attacks, and they dictate the specific thresholds that would force them to halt deployment.
While these lab policies aren't statutory laws, their impact on the market is profound. Enterprise buyers are reading Anthropic's responsible scaling policy and using it as a weapon against other vendors.
Oh, absolutely.
Procurement teams are demanding, if the largest, most advanced labs in the world are rigorously testing their models for autonomous cyber capabilities before release, we absolutely expect you, a mid-tier vendor, to do the exact same thing. These voluntary lab policies have effectively established the de facto bar for responsible engineering.
And here is the vital insight that ties this all together. Whether you are analyzing the NIST AI RMF, seeking ISO 42001 certification, scrambling to comply with the EU AI Act, or holding a vendor to OpenAI's preparedness framework, our deep dive into the Layer 3 Labs research reveals that they all converge on a universal language of safety.
They all overlap.
Yes. Despite the geopolitical chaos, the actual engineering requirements are remarkably consistent. There are 10 essential controls that manifest in every single legitimate framework.
These 10 controls are the universal DNA of AI safety. If an enterprise can operationalize these 10 mechanisms, they are largely bulletproof, regardless of which regulator comes knocking.
Let's run through them. Rapid fire.
Let's do it. First, model cards. This is the absolute baseline of transparency. A model card is essentially a highly detailed nutrition label for the algorithm.
Right. It must explicitly detail the model's intended use cases, its known limitations, and critically, a summary of the training data. If a vendor cannot provide a model card, you have no idea what you are buying.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, second, pre-deployment evaluations. You cannot test an AI model in production. You must subject the model to exhaustive capability and safety testing in a sandboxed environment before it ever touches live corporate data or the public internet. You have to know its breaking points before the market finds them.
Okay, third, independent red teaming for high-impact models.
Hold on, I want to stop you on independent red teaming, because this is where a lot of companies try to cut corners.
They do.
I understand the concept of red teaming. You hire offensive security engineers,
Right.
essentially hackers, to aggressively attack the model, craft malicious prompts, attempt to break its guardrails to expose vulnerabilities. But why is it an absolute requirement that these teams be independent? Why can't an enterprise just utilize its own highly skilled internal cybersecurity team?
Because of the profound catastrophic danger of grading your own homework.
Ah,
When dealing with high-impact foundation models, systems potentially capable of writing zero-day malware or generating hyper-realistic deepfakes at scale, internal testing teams suffer from crippling systemic bias. They understand the underlying architecture, they know how the guardrails were coded, and they inherently test the system in ways they subconsciously expect it to fail.
they lack the adversarial imagination of an external attacker.
Exactly. Furthermore, internal teams are subject to immense corporate pressure. When a product launch is tied to quarterly revenue goals, internal security teams face profound friction if they attempt to delay the release over theoretical safety concerns. Independent red teaming strips away the corporate pressure and the architectural bias. They bring pure adversarial hostility.
Which is precisely why a procurement team must never simply ask a vendor, "Did you conduct red teaming?" They must demand to review the executive summaries provided by the independent auditors. You need to know exactly what the external hackers broke and how the vendor patched it.
Exactly. That distinction between internal checks and external audits is critical.
Okay, let's move to the fourth control. Documented deployment thresholds. This means a vendor must mathematically define exactly what degree of failure during those pre-deployment evaluations will automatically trigger a halt in the release cycle.
Right. If they don't have hard lines drawn before testing begins, they will just rationalize failures away to meet a deadline.
Fifth is a massive legal liability: algorithmic discrimination testing. If an enterprise deploys an AI system to filter job resumes, approve mortgage applications, determine insurance premiums, they carry the legal burden of proving the system does not exhibit bias against protected classes.
And this isn't solved by simply asking the AI to be fair. It requires rigorous statistical counterfactual testing. You run datasets containing hundreds of thousands of simulated applicants, systematically altering only demographic markers, and mathematically prove the rejection rates remain statistically identical.
Sixth, incident response plans. This is acknowledging the reality that complex systems will fail. When an AI model begins violently hallucinating data in a customer-facing application, or when an autonomous agent is breached and begins exfiltrating data, what is the exact playbook? Who has the authority to sever the API connection? Without a documented plan, a minor hallucination spirals into a brand-destroying crisis.
Seventh, maintaining a SOC2 Type 2 certification.
Explain that one.
Well, while SOC2 is a traditional cloud security standard, it serves as the foundational proxy for AI safety. If a vendor cannot prove they possess the basic competency to encrypt data, manage access controls, and secure their physical servers over a sustained period, they absolutely cannot be trusted to secure a complex neural network.
Makes total sense. Eighth, whistleblower protections. This is recognizing that the engineers building the models are usually the first to realize the model is dangerous. You must have ironclad legal and cultural protections, enabling those engineers to raise catastrophic safety concerns to the board of directors without fear of retaliation or termination.
Ninth, annual impact assessments. AI risk is not static.
Yeah.
A model that is perfectly safe deployed in a marketing context might become incredibly dangerous if the sales team quietly integrates it into a live customer negotiation pipeline. Annual assessments force an organization to audit not just the model, but how the deployment context has evolved.
And finally, the 10th control. Updates upon substantial modification. Because AI models are frequently fine-tuned with new data, their capabilities shift. You cannot rely on a safety audit conducted on version 1.0 if the vendor just pushed version 1.5 with entirely new training weights. A substantial modification requires a total reset of the pre-deployment evaluation cycle.
Right, and when you lay out those 10 controls, you clearly illuminate the incredible operational burden placed on the modern Chief Information Security Officer. The CISO's dilemma in 2026 is an excruciating high-wire act. They are trapped between the geopolitical incentives of the federal government and the punitive mandates of the states and the EU.
Let's really drill into how CISOs can evaluate the risks of voluntary versus mandatory safety compliance. Imagine a CSO operating in a mid-sized AI development firm. If they advise their CEO to fully embrace the federal track, opting into the NSA's voluntary 30-day review, what happens?
Well, the company gains access to massive operational benefits. They get early threat intelligence from the Treasury Clearinghouse, and crucially, they secure that lucrative trusted partner status, essentially guaranteeing them access to billions in federal procurement dollars.
The market pool is immense,
Yeah.
but the operational risks of that federal track are equally severe. Submitting to an NSA review risks exposing proprietary, multi-million-dollar intellectual property to government analysts.
Yeah.
Furthermore, it introduces a hard 30-day delay into their product roadmap. In the current hyper-competitive environment, allowing your competitor to launch a month ahead of you can permanently destroy your market share.
Okay, so let's say the CSO decides the federal track is too risky, and they pivot entirely to focusing on the mandatory state and European laws. What is the downside there?
The downside is surviving a regulatory onslaught without federal top cover. If they fail to meticulously adhere to the third-party audit requirements of Illinois SB 315, or if they miscalculate their compute threshold under the EU AI Act, they are not simply losing out on a government contract. They face multi-million-dollar fines, massive class action litigation, and regulatory injunctions that could force them to physically shut down their servers in certain jurisdictions.
So the CISO is forced to serve two completely different masters. How do they actually build a department that survives this?
Explain how teams can balance those voluntary safety reviews with their internal risk management goals.
Survival requires extreme efficiency. The CISO must architect a unified internal risk management ecosystem that satisfies both the intelligence community and the civilian regulators simultaneously. They cannot build a separate compliance silo for every new law.
So one system to rule them all.
Exactly. They must utilize voluntary best practices, like achieving SOC2 Type 2 certification and rigorously implementing the NIST AI RMF as the foundational bedrock. They meticulously document every internal test, every red team exercise, every bias evaluation.
So that when the auditors show up,
When Illinois regulators or EU auditors arrive demanding mandatory proof of safety, the CISO simply hands them the massive portfolio of evidence generated by their internal voluntary adherence to NIST and ISO 42001.
you collect the telemetry once, but you format it to satisfy every single framework.
It is the ultimate measure twice, cut once strategy for legal compliance. But there is a hidden variable in this equation that makes it even more volatile. What happens to the enterprise that doesn't actually build AI but just buys dozens of AI tools from third-party vendors?
Oh, that enterprise faces the silent threat of cascading reclassification. A CISO must operate under the assumption that the benign vendor tools they deploy today might be suddenly reclassified as covered frontier models by the NSA tomorrow. That is a staggering operational risk. You buy a highly capable analytics tool, it integrates deeply into your corporate workflow, and 12 months later, the NSA decides the vendor's recent software update crossed a classified cyber capability threshold.
The instant that federal designation hits your vendor, your internal risk profile detonates. Every cyber insurance policy your company holds will instantly demand an audit of how you are securing a designated national security threat on your network. Your enterprise clients will trigger audit clauses in your contracts. The board of directors will demand an immediate briefing on the deployment limits of that specific tool.
An enterprise cannot afford to be blind to the geopolitical status of the software in their tech stack.
No, they can't.
This volatility is exactly why theory and legal analysis must be forged into an actionable playbook. You need to know exactly how to behave when you are sitting across the table from a new AI vendor tomorrow morning. You cannot rely on a standard software procurement checklist.
Right. The vendor due diligence process for AI requires an entirely new discipline. There are 3 essential non-negotiable steps your procurement team must execute before a master services agreement is ever drafted.
Let's list those 3 essential steps for teams to perform before onboarding a new AI vendor. Step 1 requires establishing the vendor's philosophical baseline, right?
Correct. Step 1. Identify the underlying safety framework the vendor utilizes. You must explicitly demand to know if their engineering teams build to the NIST AI RMF, ISO 42001, or a publicly documented lab policy, and you cannot accept marketing copy as proof. You must verify the artifacts.
Show me the papers.
Exactly. If they claim adherence to ISO 42001, your procurement team must demand the physical certificate from the accredited auditor. If they claim NIST, you demand to see their documented map and measure protocols.
Step 2 moves from the philosophy to the actual mechanics of safety.
Step 2. Demand comprehensive documentation of the 10 core controls we just discussed. Your team must focus with laser precision on 2 specific artifacts. First, their SOC2 Type 2 report. If they cannot prove basic information security competency, the conversation ends immediately.
And the second artifact.
Second, demand the executive summaries of their independent red teaming exercises. If a vendor refuses to share the red teaming summary, citing proprietary secrecy, you must assume they either found catastrophic vulnerabilities they haven't fixed, or they never actually utilized an independent auditor. In either scenario, you walk away.
Step 3 requires the procurement team to actually do the math on the vendor's behalf.
Yes. Step 3 is mapping the vendor's model against global compute thresholds. You must ask the vendor's engineering team for the rough FLOP count utilized during the model's training phase.
Because if that number approaches 10 to the 25th power FLOPs,
your legal team must immediately anticipate that deploying this model will entangle your organization in EU AI Act compliance obligations. If it approaches 10 to the 26th FLOPs, California SB 53 applies. You have to understand the mathematical architecture of the tool to calculate your future legal liability.
having that 3-step strategy is essential for the procurement team. But when you are actually in the room, when you have the vendor sales rep and their lead engineer on the Zoom call, you need tactical, surgical questions. Let's outline the key questions procurement teams should ask vendors regarding their AI model security. What are the exact questions that will immediately expose a vendor's safety culture?
The questioning must be uncompromising. The very first question out of the gate. Did you publish a detailed, publicly accessible model card? And does it contain explicit summaries of your training data provenance?
This directly addresses the massive privacy gap we highlighted earlier.
Exactly. If they obscure their training data, you have to assume it was unethically or illegally scraped, placing your enterprise at severe risk of downstream copyright litigation.
The second question strikes at their deployment discipline. You ask, what are your explicit, documented, pre-deployment evaluation thresholds?
You are demanding to know the specific metric of failure that would compel their CEO to halt a product launch. If the sales rep stutters or the engineer admits they evaluate safety on a case-by-case basis, it means they have no actual safety culture. They are entirely driven by launch deadlines.
Third, are your models currently subject to California SB 53 or the EU General Purpose AI regulations? And if they answer yes, you follow up immediately by requesting copies of the mandatory safety disclosures they have submitted to those regulatory bodies.
If they are legally required to prove their safety to the state of California, they should be perfectly willing to prove it to you.
The fourth question is where the legal team takes over. You ask, are you willing to execute an AI-specific contract addendum and a custom data processing agreement, or DPA?
Right. You cannot simply sign a legacy software as a service contract when buying an AI tool. If that tool is ingesting your proprietary corporate data, your financial records, or your customer communications, you need an ironclad legal guarantee that your data will never be utilized to train their future commercial models.
Because if they refuse to sign the DPA, they are planning to mine your corporate data for their own benefit.
Definitely. And the final critical question. What is your exact step-by-step incident response plan when the model experiences a catastrophic failure post-release?
If the AI begins aggressively hallucinating in a customer-facing portal, or if the autonomous agent is breached by a third party, who exactly do we call?
What is your contractual service level agreement for deploying a patch? And what is your legal obligation to notify our compliance team? If their incident response plan is essentially submit a ticket to IT support, the operational risk of deploying that tool is unacceptable.
Let's take a step back and synthesize the sheer magnitude of the landscape we have navigated today. We are looking at a world fundamentally fractured by conflicting ideologies of control.
It's completely divided.
On one side, we have the United States federal government executing a massive pivot toward intelligence-driven oversight. They are relying on the National Security Agency, classified cyber capability benchmarks, and a high-stakes system of voluntary 30-day reviews and trusted partner incentives to secure the nation without suffocating the speed of American innovation.
And colliding directly with that intelligence-driven approach, we have the European Union and an aggressive coalition of U.S. states building rigid, transparent regulatory regimes. They are entirely reliant on public math imposing strict FLOP thresholds, demanding mandatory third-party safety audits, and weaponizing absolutely crippling financial penalties to enforce corporate compliance.
It is an incredibly hostile environment, and the enterprise CISOs, the legal teams, and the procurement directors are the ones trapped directly in the crossfire. They are tasked with the near-impossible mandate of building unified, hyper-efficient internal risk frameworks that somehow satisfy both the voluntary intelligence gathering of the NSA and the mandatory public audits of Illinois and Brussels.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave the listeners with a profound, systemic question to consider. We have extensively analyzed the immense market power driving the U.S. voluntary framework. We detailed the massive economic incentives designed to pull companies into the NSA's orbit, the trusted partner status, the exclusive threat intelligence, the monopoly on federal procurement contracts.
The gravitational pull of the federal strategy is designed to be inescapable.
Exactly. But consider the long-term structural implication if that strategy is flawlessly executed. If the voluntary framework succeeds completely, if every major frontier lab opts in and the participating corporations capture the entirety of government spending and market advantage, are we inadvertently permitting the intelligence apparatus to construct a shadow regulatory regime?
A shadow regime operating entirely parallel to democratic lawmaking.
Think about the architecture of what we are building. The rules governing the most powerful technology in human history are entirely classified. The specific benchmarks defining what constitutes a dangerous frontier model are state secrets locked in a SCIF. The public, the academic community, and civilian lawmakers have absolutely zero insight or influence over those metrics.
No transparent legislative process.
No public comment, period. No judicial review of the testing standards. Yet, because the economic incentives to participate are so overwhelmingly powerful, this completely voluntary compliance effectively morphs into a mandatory requirement for corporate survival. We may be witnessing the quiet birth of an immense regulatory state governed entirely by classified intelligence directives, operating with absolute authority and zero public scrutiny.
We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of precision in software, the desire for a clean, visible binary spec sheet. And we ended realizing that the ultimate governing force of AI in 2026 isn't a public law at all. It's a classified dossier. We haven't just muddied the waters, we've intentionally cloaked the entire ecosystem in darkness.
We really have.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive. I highly recommend that you take the tactical strategies, the vendor questions, and the legal analysis from today's discussion and immediately audit your own internal procurement frameworks. The geopolitical collision has already happened. You cannot afford to wait for the dust to settle. And one final, massive expression of gratitude to our sponsors, ComplianceHub.wiki and MyPrivacy.blog. If your enterprise needs to rapidly deploy the exact vendor questionnaires, the certifiable ISO standards, or the privacy impact assessments we tore apart today, their platforms are the definitive starting point. Until next time, keep analyzing the architecture and keep diving deep.